Gentlemen, can you all hear me? You're welcome to come a little bit further forward. I can assure you that myself and Phil don't bite. We have been fed, yes, as Phil said. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, just wish to have a few welcomes and introductions. And first of all, I just want to introduce Captain Rainer Shalmudine Hare, who is the duty officer from R.M.B. Chivenor. Major Ian Cheeseman, who was hoping to be here, has unfortunately had to go back to Hertfordshire because his parents are unwell. So may I just thank Captain Shalmudine Hare for being here, and also for him to pass on our grateful thanks to the Garrison Commander here at Chivenor for his permission to conduct the service here today. First of all, thank you very much indeed for coming, all of you. I know some of you have had a long journey in very difficult circumstances. When I think about it, it was a bit daft organising it on a Saturday, but it happens to be the 17th of August. Just want, as I said, a few introductions. If you just put your hands up, then people can see who you are. Julian Avery, Stephen Heel, David Howells and Graham Moore and myself. We started off as 3 musketeers, we're now 5, but we're the self-styled little group that do the investigations and these commemorations. As I said, I'd like to thank the Commanding Officer of R.M.B. Chivenor, Lieutenant Colonel Anderson, and Lieutenant Colonel Ian Lamont, the Commanding Officer of 2-4 Commando, for their permission to hold the event here, and also to the Reverend Phil Waits, who's a chaplain here, who will be conducting this service. So thank you very much indeed. Also like to welcome Wing Commander Caulfield, who's come down from Abbey Wood to formally represent the Royal Air Force. Also like to welcome the Royal British Legion and the Royal Air Force Association, who are in attendance here today. Thank you very much indeed. And now specifically welcome the families. So Stanley and Birdie Johnson, who are the daughter and son, or son and daughter, of the pilot Wilfred Johnson, accompanied by Stanley's wife Jenny. To Sylvia Broadley and Sally March, and they're the daughters of the second pilot, Bill Broadley, and they're accompanied by Sylvia's daughters, Sarah Jane Brooks, Sally's husband Don March, and Sylvia's cousin Andrew Dutton and his wife Sharon, if I've got that correct. Oh, that's funny. And Carolyn Bacon, who is the daughter of the wireless operator and air gunner Lou Wilding, accompanied by her husband Simon, their daughter Emma, and her partner Leo Shadrach Sigari. And particularly thank you to Carolyn, because she's made Lou's logbook available, which has been very helpful in piecing everything together. We're here to commemorate particularly 2 deceased men, Warrant Officer Butch Hart from the Royal Canadian Air Force, and Flight Sergeant George Wilson, and to remember the 4 that survived the accident on the 17th of August 1944. But with the survivors, we mustn't forget what the physical and mental trauma that they went through as a result. In particular, George Wilson and Lou Wilding came from the same town. They served in the Home Guard together, they enlisted together, they served together, and yet George was killed and Lou survived. And, to lose your best friend must be very difficult. And also to remember Flight Sergeant Jim Milne, who was one of the crew, who took his own life in August 1951. Now, whilst we'll never know exactly why, it's possible that the trauma from all this was a factor in that. Lastly, I was intending to welcome Giles Blatchford, whose uncle was piloting the boat that crashed, but in particular I am very delighted to introduce Anne Watling Greenwood. There she is. Her father was a leading aircraftman who was acting as air gunner for James Blatchford when they took off from Chivenor in December 1940, and they crashed on the Saunton Road. And her father was seriously injured but survived and went on to become a renowned racing driver. I will only just précis the 2 incidents because there's more material, which you can read at later time. But just a little history of RAF Chivenor. It opened here on the 25th of October 1940 as a training base for Coastal Command. And the first 5 aircrew and aircraft arrived on the 27th of November. And one of those was a Beaufort, Bristol Beaufort, flown by Sergeant James Blackford. In December 1940, he was tasked with a solo nighttime practice flight, which was almost certainly his first flight at night. And I would just ask you to remember, in those days, with the blackout, with the lack of technology that we have today, it would have been a very daunting situation. They took off and sadly crashed near Saunton. Sergeant Blackford was killed, but luckily Roy Green would survive. Roy has got a fascinating life because he went on to become a renowned racing driver, and he used to build his own racing cars. He also built his own light aeroplane and made wooden propellers. What's significant about this crash is it was the first out of 3, which actually led to a change in the training regime here at Chivenor. So, it wasn't in vain. And then, moving on 4 years, more or less, Thursday the 17th of August 1944, by this time Chivenor is a main base for Coastal Command operations. And you've got to remember, this was just shortly after D-Day, when Coastal Command was involved in maximum effort to close off the English Channel to the German U-boats and destroyers still in the French bases like Brest. Most of you, I would imagine, would have heard of Operation Eagle, where 2 landing craft were sunk off the South Devon coast with heavy loss of life. Well, just imagine if the U-boats had managed to get through to the invasion convoys or the subsequent follow-up convoys and torpedo the ships full of men and equipment. What happened in Normandy could have had a very different result. And Chivenor played a key role, because what they did was they took off from here at night with their specialist radar and searchlights, and they flew up and down continuously for normally 10 hours just to make sure that no U-boats got through. If they saw a U-boat, they went in and attacked. Now, Wilfred Johnson and his second pilot, Bill Broadley, flew their first operational sortie together in May 1944. They suffered a situation on the 29th of July when, after taking off in a Wellington at 4 o'clock in the morning, the starboard engine failed, but Wilfred managed to bring the plane back in safely, crash landed, and all 6 men survived. Again, a feat of flying in itself. And then, on the 17th of August, he took off piloting another Wellington with Bill Broadley as his second pilot, Butch Butchard as his navigator, the Canadian, and then George Wilson, Lou Wilding and James Milne as the pilot operators and air gunners. Not long after taking off, their wireless failed, so they came back to Chivenor. And as they approached Chivenor, the port engine on the aircraft failed. Now at this stage, the Wellington was still carrying the 6 depth charges, because they were told to bring them home if they could, and a heavy fuel load. And it was flying the downwind leg, just over the villages of Flemington and Bickington on the other side of the river. No doubt, Flight Lieutenant Johnson consulted his crew, and they agreed to go around and to drop the depth charges over Saunton Sands, the large sand dunes over there, and the beach. Because dropping them over land, there was a big American hospital at Flemington. As it came round here, Chivenor it all comprised wooden huts in those days. There was a big dance taking place here, so you can imagine if you dropped a 250-pound depth charge here and it exploded, it would cause significant damage and casualties. So they decided to fly on to Saunton Sands, safely drop the depth charges, jettison some fuel, and then come back up the river again. Now normally, if you have an engine fail, you turn in the direction of the working engine. But of course, Wilfred Johnson couldn't turn to starboard because of all the hills, and he's now quite low. So he had to come round to port, fly back up the river, and then he tried to come around. But if you can imagine flying that Wellington on one engine, it's still a very heavy aircraft, at night, and it's a remarkable feat that he managed to get it around without stalling, because the aircraft must have been close to stalling speed. Unfortunately, he couldn't quite turn the aircraft sharply enough to line up with the runway. And what he did was that, having realised that he could not make the runway, and he was now down to about 20 feet, he made the decision to crash land literally just over here. As you came into Chivenor, you came off one roundabout and down to a second roundabout. In between those two roundabouts was a level crossing, because the railway line used to run up there. And they struck a telegraph pole, so you can tell how high the plane was. And the plane crash landed on the other side of the road, came across the road and ended up against the wall of the chapel. Now, sadly, two people, as I've alluded to, Butch Butchart and George Wilson, both died. But remarkably, the other four survived. It's worth noting that Wilfred Johnson suffered a broken leg and other injuries, and Bill Broadley lost an arm because I think he was ejected out through the windscreen. Lou Wilding and Jim Milne escaped with minor injuries. So you can see that it was quite a remarkable feat that four of them survived. Unfortunately, there's another heroine to the story, which we don't know who she is, but an unknown member of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force heard the crash, came forward and actually pulled Bill Broadley away from the scene before the aircraft caught fire, because it still had a lot of fuel on board. Both pilots were taken to the North Devon Infirmary of Barnstable, and if you can imagine, that was the beginning of a long period of rehabilitation and recovery for them. Butch Butchart is buried up at the Parish Church of St Augustine's at Henton, and what we propose is that after this service and an opportunity to visit the crash scene and another cup of tea, those of us who are interested will go up to Henton and pay our respects to the Canadian who died so far away from home. Of course, his body couldn't be repatriated because of the distance. George Wilson was taken home to Urmston in Lancashire, which was his home, where he is laid to rest. What I'm now going to do is invite the Reverend Phil Waits to actually conduct a short service, I appreciate my printer broke, so I haven't got many of the orders of service, but it should be able to follow, and if there's any, just go with the flow, if you know what I mean. Phil.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Do not let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God and trust in me. There are many rooms in my Father's house. If there were not, I should have told you. I am now going to prepare a place for you. And after I've gone and prepared you a place, I shall come to take you with me, so that where I am, you may be too. Thomas said, Lord, we do not know where you are going, so how can we know the way? Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one can come to me except through the Father. That reading always gives me a lot of help and encouragement. It was a reading that when I was ordained 27 years ago, I took as my spiritual guidance. And in the era that we are commemorating today, Nazi oppression was at its height. The RAF from this base were engaged in bringing that regime to an end. And it is right to thank God for the brave men and women who serve this nation in the time of need, and also today's military personnel who are ready to lay down their lives for our freedom. The church and the military are very close together. We all have a hierarchical structure that we sometimes disagree with. Take for example, St. Ignatius of Loyola, a soldier who became the leader of the Jesuits, and the Remy Regiment of St. Eligius as their patron saint. The Royal Engineers have St. Barbara, the RAF, St. Michael. And of course we remember that a Roman centurion